Okay, get ready to have your minds blown because today we're taking a deep dive into brain tweaking with magnets.
It sounds like something straight out of sci-fi, right?
Right, but it's totally real. We're talking about transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS.
And the amazing thing is that TMS allows us to directly influence brain activity. And get this, it's completely non-invasive.
No surgery.
Nope. No surgery, no implants, just targeted magnetic pulses.
Wow, so no scalpels or electrodes, just magnets. And we've got a stack of research articles and fact sheets here ready to dive in. You want to know how TMS works, especially this thing called rTMS, repetitive TMS, am I right?
You got it.
It seems like you're especially interested in how rTMS is being used therapeutically.
Definitely.
So we'll be sure to cover that in depth, especially some of the newest research on its potential for memory and cognitive function.
Sounds good.
Now, knowing your interest in rTMS for things like memory and cognitive function, I think it's even more fascinating to look back at the history of this whole field. Did you know scientists were already experimenting with brain stimulation back in the early 1900s?
Oh, yeah.
That's a long time ago.
It is. It goes way back. But of course, it was a lot less precise back then. We're talking animal studies where they were basically putting electrodes directly into the brain.
Correctly into the brain.
Yeah,
To study how electrical currents affect neuron activity.
exactly.
That's a far cry from the non-invasive techniques we have today.
Yeah,
I'm guessing those early experiments were pretty intense.
you could say that. But, even with those early methods, they discovered something that's still relevant to how TMS works today.
Okay, like what?
The difference between direct and indirect stimulation of neurons.
Direct and indirect, what's the difference?
So sometimes they found that the electrical stimulation would directly trigger a neuron to fire, like flipping a light switch. But other times it would activate a whole cascade of activity, stimulating one neuron that then passed the signal on to others, like a chain reaction.
Interesting. So even back then, scientists were already grappling with this idea of fine-tuning brain activity.
Yes,
And that's still the core challenge with TMS today, right?
exactly. And as you might imagine, that indirect stimulation, the chain reaction, turned out to be much more complex,
I bet.
but also way more intriguing when it came to potentially influencing brain function in a more, shall we say, nuanced way.
Okay, so that brings us a step closer to how TMS works. So we're talking about basically jump-starting the brain with magnets, but in a way that's safe and controlled.
Exactly.
So fast forward a bit, and we get to the point where researchers are finally able to try stimulating the human brain.
Right.
But there was this brief time before TMS where they were using transcranial electrical stimulation.
Yeah, I can't imagine that was very pleasant.
I was just thinking that the idea was similar to TMS, but instead of magnetic pulses, they were using electrodes on the scalp.
To deliver electrical currents.
Right.
It's really no wonder that TMS became the preferred method.
Yeah, I can only imagine what those research participants were feeling. More than a little buzz, I'd say. But thankfully, in the 1980s...
TMS comes along.
Exactly. TMS comes along, and it's like a whole new ballgame, right? More tolerable for the patient and way more precise.
Absolutely. And that precision is one of the most remarkable things about TMS. We're not just generally stimulating the brain here. We can target very specific areas.
Really?
It's almost like a surgeon with a magnetic scalpel.
Okay, now you're just showing off. So how does it actually work? We're not talking about magnetic mind control here, are we?
Wait.
Okay, good. So I was about to get a little freaked out.
Basically, a TMS device generates a very brief but powerful magnetic pulse. And this pulse is focused through a coil, which is held against the scalp.
So we're sending these magnetic pulses through the skull.
Exactly. And as that magnetic field rapidly changes, it actually induces electrical currents in the brain tissue directly beneath the coil.
Okay, so it's those currents that are actually influencing the activity of the neurons in that specific area.
Yes, exactly. And we can move that coil around and target different brain regions, which is what makes it so precise.
That's wild. It's like we can fine-tune different circuits in the brain. So let's talk more about the repetitive part of rTMS, because that seems to be where the real therapeutic potential comes in, right? Especially for things like depression.
You're right on the money. With rTMS, we're delivering a whole series of those magnetic pulses in a rhythmic pattern, not just a single pulse.
So instead of just giving the brain a quick jolt, we're sending these repeated pulses.
Exactly. Think of it like gently tapping a drum head versus beating it rhythmically.
Okay, I'm with you.
The single tap might create a sound, but the repeated beats, that's what really gets the drum head vibrating and creates a sustained effect.
So the repeated magnetic pulses of rTMS are like those rhythmic drum beats.
Yes. And they're influencing how active certain areas of the brain are.
Even after the stimulation stops.
You got it. It's like we're giving those brain circuits a workout, helping them to fire more efficiently.
And these changes, they last even after the treatment is over.
That's the idea. And that's what researchers believe is the key to treating conditions like depression, where certain brain areas might be underactive.
That makes a lot of sense. But I have to ask, if we're essentially rewiring the brain, what about safety?
That's a completely valid question. And thankfully, rTMS has a very good safety profile.
Oh, good.
The side effects are generally mild and temporary, especially compared to other brain stimulation techniques.
Well, that's reassuring to hear. But what about specifics? What kind of side effects are we talking about?
Well, the most common ones are headaches, some scalp discomfort at the stimulation site. It can feel a bit like tapping or tingling.
Yeah.
And sometimes even some facial twitching. But again, I want to emphasize that these usually lessen as the treatment goes on.
The brain gets used to it.
Exactly.
Okay. That makes sense. Nothing too alarming there. But before we move on, there's one more thing I have to ask about. And forgive me if this seems a bit out there, but seizures?
Okay, sure.
Is there any risk of rTMS triggering a seizure?
You're right to ask that, and it's something we take very seriously. There is a very small risk of seizure associated with rTMS. We're talking less than 1 in 1,000.
Okay, so very, very rare.
Very rare. But it's important to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is that if a seizure were to occur, it would happen during the stimulation itself.
And it would stop once the stimulation stops.
Yes. It's temporary.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. So while there is that very, very small risk, it's a temporary one.
Oh.
And only during the actual treatment.
Right.
But I imagine there are some people who probably shouldn't try rTMS at all, just to be on the safe side.
Absolutely. There are definitely some contraindications, as with any medical treatment.
Yeah.
The most obvious one is having any metal in your head, like implanted devices.
Makes sense.
Or even certain types of metallic tattoos near the head.
Wait, tattoos? Really?
Oh, yeah. It's true. If you have a tattoo with metallic ink, especially near the head or face, it's crucial to let your doctor know.
Because?
That metal can interfere with the magnetic fields.
Wow, I had no idea.
You learn something new every day.
I do. Every time I talk to you, I learn something new. What about other conditions? Like, would someone with epilepsy be a good candidate for rTMS?
Epilepsy is another one where we proceed with a lot of caution because rTMS involves stimulating brain activity, right? So it's not generally recommended for people with epilepsy.
Because it could potentially increase the risk of a seizure.
Exactly.
Right, that makes sense. So while it's considered very safe overall, it's crucial to talk to your doctor to make sure rTMS is right for you.
Precisely. A thorough evaluation is always key.
Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about how rTMS works, but let's dive into the why.
Yeah.
You mentioned depression. Can you tell us more about how rTMS is being used to treat that?
Sure. One of the most promising applications of rTMS is in treating major depressive disorder, especially in cases where traditional antidepressants haven't been effective.
So for people who haven't had any luck with medication.
Exactly. Or if they experience intolerable side effects from the medication.
That's huge. We have a fact sheet here from Black Dog Institute, and they've been researching this for a long time, since 1997.
Wow, 1997. Speaking of long-term research, the Black Dog Institute has been studying this since 97, and they highlight that rTMS can be a really valuable alternative for people who haven't had success with medication or who can't tolerate those side effects.
And I imagine it's a relief for many people to know there's another option, especially one that doesn't involve, well, more pills.
Right.
But how does the treatment actually work in practice? What does it look like for the patient?
Well, a typical course of rTMS for depression involves daily sessions, usually 5 days a week, for several weeks. And each session itself is relatively short, somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes.
So we're talking about a commitment.
Yes.
But it's not like a hospital stay or anything.
No. rTMS is done on an outpatient basis.
You come in for your session, get your brain stimulated, and then go about your day.
Exactly.
That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. But the million-dollar question, of course, is does it actually work?
Yeah. Well, we also have some guidance here from NICE.
Nice.
The UK's National Institute for Health and Care Excellence.
Ah, okay.
And they've reviewed a ton of research on rTMS for depression.
They sound like a pretty trustworthy source. What's the verdict?
The good news is they say rTMS can be effective for depression.
That is good news.
Even in those really tough cases where nothing else seems to help.
Wow. So even when other treatments haven't worked.
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing. But I'm guessing there are some caveats, right? Like with any treatment.
You're right. It's not a magic bullet, you
Yeah.
know. It doesn't work for everyone, and it's not a guaranteed cure.
Right.
The results do vary from person to person.
That makes sense. I mean, every brain is different. It's
Exactly.
just like every person is different.
And to give you some further context,
Okay.
Nices also points out that it's not as effective as electroconvulsive therapy. That's the ECT we talked about earlier.
Right, right.
So it's not meant to replace those more intensive interventions that are sometimes needed in the most severe cases.
Okay, so it's a promising option, especially for those who haven't had success with other treatments. But it's important to have realistic expectations.
Well said.
It's a tool in the toolbox, not a magic wand.
Exactly. And what's even more exciting is that researchers are exploring the potential of rTMS for a whole host of other conditions beyond just depression.
Now we're talking, I know this is right up your alley, considering your interest in things like memory and cognitive function.
It is.
What else is on the horizon?
One area that's particularly fascinating is the use of rTMS for mild cognitive impairment, or MCI.
Yes. For those of us who aren't fluent in neurology, can you explain what MCI is?
So MCI is kind of a gray area
Okay.
between normal age-related cognitive decline
Okay.
and full-blown dementia.
So like somewhere between those two.
Yes, exactly. It's characterized by memory problems and other cognitive changes that are more noticeable than what you'd expect for someone's age, but they're not severe enough to interfere with daily life.
So it's like a warning sign,
Yeah.
potentially? A potential precursor to something like Alzheimer's disease.
Exactly, and that's what makes this research so exciting.
I can imagine.
If we can intervene early with something like rTMS,
Yeah?
we might be able to slow down or even prevent the progression to dementia.
Okay, that's huge. But what's the evidence so far? Does rTMS actually seem to help with MCI?
There's a 2023 study that really caught my eye, and it might be one of the reasons you're so interested in this.
Oh, really?
It looked at using rTMS over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Say that 10 times fast.
I know, right?
Don't worry about the technical name, but it's this area of the brain that plays a big role in both our mood and how we think, which is why it's so intriguing for researchers.
Exactly, and what they found was really interesting.
Hard to find.
rTMS over this area led to a decrease in certain molecules called MMPs.
MMPs, what are those?
They're matrix metalloproteinases.
Okay, I'm not even going to try to say that one.
Don't worry about it.
But those MMPs, they're linked to neuroinflammation.
Yes, essentially the brain's inflammatory response.
Okay, so less inflammation in the brain, that's got to be a good thing, right?
It is, especially in the context of MCI and Alzheimer's,
Right.
where neuroinflammation is thought to play a role in actually damaging brain cells.
So reducing that inflammation could potentially protect the brain.
That's the idea.
Now that is remarkable.
Now, I do want to emphasize that this was a small study,
Okay.
so we definitely need more research to confirm these findings.
Of course, of course.
But the potential implications are enormous.
I can see why you're excited about this. If we can use rTMS to not only treat depression, but also potentially slow down cognitive decline, that's amazing.
It's huge. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Researchers are exploring the use of rTMS for all sorts of other conditions,
Like what?
like stroke rehabilitation,
Okay.
Parkinson's disease,
Wow.
even chronic pain.
It seems like the possibilities are pretty much endless.
They really are. It's an exciting field.
It is, and to think, we started this deep dive with a simple magnet
That's how it always starts.
and a question about how it could possibly influence the brain.
And look where we ended up.
Exploring the frontiers of neuroscience and the potential of rTMS to not only treat existing conditions, but maybe even prevent them altogether.
And that's what I find so fascinating about this field. The potential is just mind-blowing. And you know what? That study about rTMS and MMPs really got me thinking.
Oh, yeah. What about,
If we can influence the levels of those molecules in the body with targeted brain stimulation, what other biological processes might we be able to affect?
it's like opening up a whole new world of possibilities.
Exactly.
That is a fantastic question, and I think it's the perfect note to end on.
I agree.
If we can potentially influence things like inflammation through targeted brain stimulation, what other possibilities are out there, it's something for all of us to ponder. If you're as intrigued by the potential of rTMS as we are, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions does this spark for you? Send them our way, and maybe your question will inspire a future deep dive. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.